Hey everyone, I'm Rick Becker, host of the Irish Baseball Podcast, joined today by David Bedford. David, thank you so much for making some time for us.
Absolute pleasure. And obviously, I am an absolute expert on Irish baseball, whatever that is.
No, that is not why we are having you on the show today. And um, a lot of people definitely confuse the fact that, yes, we talk about topics that are Irish and we talk about topics that have to do with baseball. They don't always have to be the two meeting. But this one, it will a little bit, and I'll explain later. But we're going to talk a lot about the Beatles today. You are an expert on the Beatles. We're going to talk about them in general in a little bit. But I want to start off with the fact that the Beatles are four men of Irish descent. And that Irish ancestry did play maybe a bigger part in the Beatles and their progression as a band and their identity as four individual men than maybe a lot of people talk about when they are talking about this group that changed the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the Irish had a massive influence on Liverpool, and therefore anybody from Liverpool has that Irish influence with them. And the fact that they could have a more direct link as well just adds to it even more. Um, the one who had the tenuous links, which took a while to find, was Ringo. I think they found it went down on through one of his aunties on that side. They found his descent in County Mayo, I think it was. Um, but obviously, with Paul is the most Irish of them all because his mother was Irish first generation, born over there and brought over to Liverpool. So there was a lot of Irishness right all the way through Paul's life there. And one of the big things that the Irish brought to Liverpool, of course, was not just their music history, but that whole idea of the family culture, that the whole family gets together and celebrates and parties. And so Paul McCartney would talk of, the family parties. There's always a piano in the house. Everybody really played an instrument of some sort, and everybody had to do a song. So to go round, every member of the family would have to do a song, and you would just hope that the one that you perfected wasn't sung by somebody else. But if it was the only one that you knew, you still did it anyway, and nobody cared. So that was really important from a musical point of view for Paul. But yeah, we can trace John's back all the way through to his great grandfather arriving, as lots of the Irish did, was during the Great Famine of the 1840s, when 1.5 million Irish people came through Liverpool. Now, of course, most of them went over and populated the east coast of America, but about 30,000 or so stayed, and that population then grew and grew. And Liverpool, from the mid 1800s, then becomes quite an Irish city, and it's probably the most Irish of the English cities around. That big influence, and the music is probably the most important thing because the Irish music, the folk music influence. If we know our roots of country music, and one of the books I've written is called the Country of Liverpool, Nashville of the North, then country music's roots are in the Ulster Scots, because the Ulster Scots, Northern Ireland, Scotland, that Celtic music, they're the ones who cross the Atlantic, go to the Appalachian Mountains, then it comes down from the Appalachians, and that then becomes your roots of country. And so country music starts obviously in Bristol, but then massively in Nashville. But the roots of American country music are in those Ulster Scots and that British folk music. So as well as it going across the Atlantic, they brought it across the Irish Sea to Liverpool. So Liverpool ended up at the same time the Beatles was going on. It was the biggest country and western scene in Britain. So all the Irish music with the roots of country, that was everywhere in Liverpool. So the beat music, Mersey beat as it became known, was just a part of the Liverpool music scene.
And that Liverpool music scene is where you are definitely an expert because your life has, whether all of this was intentional or not, has really followed the Beatles around this city, and you have lived within blocks of some of these major locations in Beatles history. So why don't you just talk a little bit about that?
Okay, so where I grew up was the area known as the Dingle, and obviously there's a place in Ireland, the Dingle Peninsula. So we have the Dingle in Liverpool, and where you came out of my back gate from my childhood house was at the bottom of Madryn Street, and Madryn Street is where Ringo was born. And so the primary school that Ringo went to is the primary school that I then went to. So I started there at the age of 4 back in 1969, which gives my age away. So I did that 69 to 76. And I lived around there. When I first got married, we first lived just 2 streets up from the house Ringo grew up in. And then we moved to Penny Lane, and our 3 daughters were born in the same hospital as John. And all 3 attended the same primary school as John and George. And I've literally just moved 2 weeks ago. And I've left Penny Lane after nearly 37 years. I'm on the edge of a place called Highton, and I'm 5 minutes away from where Stuart Sutcliffe, the Beatles bass player, first Beatles bass player, where he grew up. So even when I'm looking unintentionally, the intention was never to move to Penny Lane. That was just where we saw the house. Thought, oh, that'll do. So even this latest move, not intentional, but I'm literally round the corner from where Stuart grew up, and about 10 minutes away from the cemetery where Stuart was buried. So yeah, I've had it my whole life.
Wow, that is amazing. So, with the exception of just this connection to the Beatles in your hometown, your home city, what is it about them for you personally that made the Beatles something where you were going to dedicate your life to chronicling this band?
It was the love and the passion for Liverpool. And again, maybe that's something we've inherited from the Irish as well. No, there's a real pride in our city that we happen to be geographically in England, but not really part of it. We're almost like with the People's Republic of Merseyside. We have our own identity. We all stick together. It's our place, and we're proud of the people who come from here. And I think being involved, in film projects, documentaries, as well as all the books, etc. When you look at the early years, it's the origins stories. Hamburg is what makes the Beatles. And you can see from the shameless plug, my latest book, The Beatles What If, was because of all this research. There are so many of these turning points. And one of those big ones is, what if they don't go to Hamburg? And Hamburg's what makes them so successful. And this is all the stuff that most people don't know because it happened before they were famous. Hamburg becomes important, but when you study the Hamburg story, it's just the story of 5 teenage lads having a chance to go and play music somewhere else. They were average at best, rubbish a lot of the time because they'd only been a rock and roll group for 3 months when they went to Hamburg. They were not great. And that's the bit of the story which for me is fantastic because they were just these young lads and they got this opportunity to go over to Hamburg and they dedicated it and they did their 10,000 hours plus on the stage. That's where they learned to be a band. And I think the lovely thing about it is it's those early years because the way Brian Epstein packaged the Beatles, it was the Beatles are John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Brian was the manager. They're from Liverpool, and off you go, and off to fame. And yet, John starts the Quarrymen in 1956, 6 years before any of that happens. And so, my passion's been to fill in what happened in those 6 years to get them to that point. Why Liverpool? Why them? And I think for a lot of people, particularly fans talking to fans in America, Because when the Beatles arrive and they're doing all the TV interviews, and of course they're really funny, everybody's laughing, and people assume that they were these four comedians from Liverpool. They were just like any Liverpudlian because you can go anywhere in Liverpool and you'll find people cracking jokes just like that. It's exactly the same. They were just being themselves, and that was the great thing about them. They were breaking the mold of this idol is created by the record company and will stick you in these lovely suits, and this is what you will say. They said, no, that's not how we play. We make our own rules, we go along. And they just did it. But that didn't come like overnight. It took all these years, these little moments, just to get the opportunity to make a record.
And there are a lot of stories about the Beatles, when they came over to the United States in 1964, and people were acting like they had these classy upper crust accents because to the American ear, all of the English accents sound the same, right? And it turns out that they had these working class Irish immigrant accents in England. Like if you would talk to somebody in England, they didn't think that the Beatles talked with a classy accent.
Not
And
at all.
that is such an important part of their legacy is this accent that they bring, and they didn't shy away from it. They didn't try to sound different. They didn't try to sound like they weren't from Liverpool. They had that pride in their heritage. So why don't you talk about that a little bit and just how much Liverpool influenced them, even if maybe the people in the United States didn't know that, but over in England, it had to be as clear as day.
Yeah, absolutely. That was one of the biggest barriers they came up against because up to that point, so the star from Liverpool before them was Billy Fury, who many people haven't heard of, but is now acknowledged as Britain's first true rock and roll star and our first answer to Elvis. Now he came from the Dingle as well, where Ringo's from, and his first album called The Sound of Fury is now acknowledged as Britain's first true rock and roll album. And he wrote all the songs on there. And the very first day, well, called themselves the Silver Beatles, that they are a rock and roll group, was to audition to be Billy Fury's backing band, which they didn't get. Um, but of course, Billy Fury was a singer plucked from Liverpool, taken down to London, tidied up, and then off he goes and he does his singing career. But you wouldn't really know that he was from Liverpool. What the Beatles wanted to do was to break the mold. And the first visit down to Abbey Road Studios in June '62, the engineers remarked and said, what the hell are these? Because they're still scruffy, jeans, leather jackets. Even if on stage they were, wearing suits, it didn't matter because they were just them with sort of longish hair and they kept their accent. And it's one of the things when they did the Decca audition at the beginning of '62, one of the reasons they were turned down was because Brian Poole and the Tremolos lived locally. Because nobody within London, where all the record companies were, where the media was based, nobody would think of leaving London to go and look for talent. It had to come to them. And if it didn't, tough, it never happened. So that was one of the big barriers that they had was being from Liverpool because everyone on the BBC, because you only had one national radio station called the BBC, you had to speak with the Queen's English. And that's one of those things that the Beatles did. They broke that mold and regional accents then started to appear and are still used now on radio and television. But back then, it was a hindrance, so much so for Paul McCartney that his mum, who wanted Paul to be a teacher, sent him for elocution lessons to lose his Liverpool accent.
Wow.
And that, yeah, so the accent was a massive barrier to overcome in this country, let alone when they went abroad.
It's so interesting to see this correlation, and maybe it doesn't have quite as much to do with their Irish background, but it definitely is their working class background. And you see some of the similarities even in the immigration just very quickly right across that small sea and how they're treated in Liverpool to how the Irish were treated in the United States. And
Yeah.
I love seeing those connections and seeing how they worked past those things. One thing that I have noticed in very recent years, and this was something I really wanted to bring up to you, is when John Lennon was killed in 1980, he was almost deified in the immediate aftermath of
Yeah.
his assassination. But in the 46 years now since he was assassinated, I feel like there's been a lot of revisionist history trying to knock down John Lennon and to sort of take shots at his character. You were part of a documentary called Looking for Lennon, and I want to talk about how when it comes to John Lennon, a lot of the things that we know about him that would be considered negatives, we only know because he told us, right? Where a lot of people will act like, oh, we discovered that when he was a younger man, he didn't treat women properly. And his first child, he wasn't a very good father to him. But those are things that John Lennon himself admitted. And I feel like while John Lennon was certainly a flawed individual, I
Aren't we
think
all?
because of that brushback to how he was deified in 1980, in 1981, in the immediate aftermath of his assassination, people have tried to like knock down this figure. And I think the pendulum has flown way too far in the other direction.
Well, I think that that's the modern world we're in now. Is that one of the worst things you can ever do? And the same as applied in Britain for a long time as well. One of the worst things you can ever do is be successful. Because once you're successful and you're up on a pedestal, there's everybody think, right, we've got to knock them down. And especially these days with with the internet, with social media, or the keyboard warriors, it's the safest thing to do is sit behind a screen in your house and slag everybody off that you want to, which you wouldn't say to their face. And I think, yeah, there was a big issue with John suddenly becomes a saint because he's been killed young. And that, I think, was a massive, massive problem for Paul. And I think Paul has struggled for acceptance and recognition because of John has been deified like that. Um, but yeah, no, it's come the other way around where people like to cancel. I think is the in phrase. Apparently, the young people tell me um, it's the thing to do. It's to knock somebody off the pedestal like that. What we wanted to do with looking for Lennon was not excuse what John did, but try and understand why he did these things. Now, if you think about it, that he didn't really have his dad around. Now, to be fair to Alf, Alf was on the merchant navy ships, dodging U-boats crossing the Atlantic, which is a reasonable excuse not to be around. At the age of 5, he's taken away by social services from his mum, which is traumatic in itself. He then has to choose between his mum and his dad, who he wants to live with. He chooses his mum, but he can't live with his mum because he's got to be placed by social services with his auntie and uncle. Mimi is very strict, isn't maternal. His Uncle George becomes his father figure, and they have a really close relationship. Uncle George dies when John's 14, so he's lost the father figure. At which point he's reconnecting with his mum. His mum teaches him music, encourages music, buys him his first guitar, teaches him to play it, comes along to the gigs, and then she's knocked down and killed by a car when he's 17, when he goes into really, really deep depression. No surprise. And then at art college, he's met Stuart Sutcliffe, who he really looks up to. John admires Stuart. They become as close as brothers, and then suddenly Stuart dies from brain hemorrhage, age 21, in early 1962. So John's had all of these significant events happen to him before fame. Now, it only takes one of those to happen for it to affect your character for the rest of your life. To have all of those happen in your formative years, in an age where boys were not allowed to cry, boys certainly did not talk about feelings, everything got bottled up. And the problem then was, how do you deal with it? And John didn't know how to deal with it. He couldn't have sensible, kind, loving relationships with women because all of that had been destroyed in his childhood. So he tries to deal with the pain and he tries pills and alcohol. And then he gets onto the harder drugs, which eventually leads to onto heroin and then heroin withdrawal, and going cold turkey. All of that while dealing with fame and all the happiness he thought he was going to find with fame, whether it was money, whether it was girls, just the popularity of it, whatever it was, did not bring him happiness. So by 1965, he writes the song Help, and it's a genuine cry for help. But because it then becomes the theme song for the film, and they speed it up and it becomes a poppy song, everybody missed it completely. And he literally was saying, "Help me if you can, I'm feeling down." So he was so messed up. It wasn't until he did therapy a few years later that he could actually go back to the childhood trauma and start dealing with everything that had happened to him. So my view is always, I don't excuse anything he's done. I just want to understand what he did. And thankfully that through all those processes, he found peace. He found, a loving relationship with Yoko. He had another son in Sean. He was able to reconnect with Julian. He had that time at home looking after Sean. And the sad, sad thing, of course, he then comes back to recording, and his new song is Just Like Starting Over. And just when he's really at peace with everything, he's assassinated. So, yeah, he's not a saint at all, but understand the guy a little bit more. That's my way.
And he certainly did try in his own way to push for things that would be generally considered positives. And maybe in his own personal life, he didn't express those values as well as he could. At least it feels like, unlike a lot of people, he was trying. He was trying to be a better person. And that gets lost in the shuffle a little bit. The one
Yeah,
way in which the Beatles story ties in with baseball is they come over to the United States. It's 1964, and they're so big that they can't play the traditional venues. And they come over to the US and start what is the stadium
yeah,
tour because
yeah,
they have to play places like Shea Stadium, the Giant Stadium in San Francisco. They're playing baseball stadiums instead of playing clubs when most bands would have been playing clubs. When you think about that one year and that first tour in the United States, and you think about how that changed the way we view concerts.
yeah. Although completely, and for them it was wild. Having two concerts at Shea Stadium. Getting the record was at 55,000 people who were there, and I've spoken to several people who were there um, at the Shea Stadium concerts. And the problem was they didn't have the equipment to deal with a stadium concert like we know now. When you see this massive stage and speaker towers and everything everywhere. They had these two little Vox 8030 amplifiers and the PA tannoy system. I mean, it was awful. I mean, it's bad enough at just a tannoy at a baseball game, a football game. They had to use that to perform. And the problem was they stuck out in the field, right in the middle, hundreds of meters away from the crowd. And they didn't like that at all. And they then couldn't hear each other. They weren't even sure if they were playing the same song. Ringo famously said he was watching John's bum cheeks going up and down like that, so he knew what rhythm. So that's how bad that it got because the equipment wasn't ready. But yeah, they were the first stadium concerts. Um, that's the kind of thing that led to them giving up touring because they'd grown up in these little places in Liverpool, like the Cavern, the Casbah Club, little church halls, where literally the crowd were like 2 feet in front of them. In the Cavern, they had the other rows of chairs. They knew everybody because they all had their own seat. They could talk to them. They were shouting out requests. They were communicating with the crowd. And you speak to any musician, they'll tell you they feed off the energy in the room. Well, if you're stuck on the stage in the middle of a baseball field and all you can hear is this deafening sound of screaming, how can you progress as a musician? How can you enjoy that as a musician? And what these had in Hamburg was playing between 6 and 8 hours a night, choosing whatever songs they wanted to play, whatever order. Once they made it famous and they were on tour, they were only on stage for 25, 30 minutes, playing exactly the same 5, 6, 10 songs every night. And they said, this is pointless, which is why they then quit touring in 66. What was the point?
No, I can understand that. And I just want to move back to the Irish aspect of the Beatles for a quick second here, because there was a story that I have heard that after Bloody Sunday in Ireland, when of course Paul McCartney writes his famous Irish song, John Lennon writes his famous Irish song, that John Lennon actually reached out to Paul McCartney to try to get him to play a show that was going to be focused on raising money and raising awareness for the issue in Northern Ireland. And this could have ended up being not the four members getting back together and playing like we can speculate might have happened after 1980. But it would have been a situation where maybe Paul McCartney and John Lennon would have been in the same place where they could have jammed together and we would have had that mini reunion that everybody always wanted. So, why don't you just very briefly talk about that almost encounter that could have happened?
This happened a couple of times in the 70s. Um, yeah, obviously the Troubles as they became known, I thought was a understated way to deal with what was going on in Ireland. Um, so Paul does give Ireland back to the Irish, and John does the look of the Irish. Um, and that was the look at the Irish roots and thinking, this isn't right. Something needs to be done. And I think maybe they were happy to go that far with the politics. Maybe John would have gone further than Paul. He was quite aware of what you should and shouldn't do. But yeah, there's only been a couple of occasions where there's one that was a TV show, Saturday Night Live. John and Paul were watching, and the guy held up and said, "Here's a check for $3,000. All you got to do, come down here, sing 3 songs. That's all." And because Paul was staying with John at the Dakota, they thought, "Do you know what? We could do that." And then, as Paul said, and it's in his latest documentary, Man on the Run, and he says, "Hang on, why would we be doing this? Would we be doing this for us? No. Will we be doing it for them? Yeah, yeah. Let's stay and have another cup of tea." And that's the motivation they had to think of. Would they be doing something for them because they want to do it, or is it just it was a thing on for a popular TV show to claim, look, we got the Beatles back together.
Very, very interesting. I know another thing that people tend to speculate is that Live Aid would have been the big reunion if John had not been assassinated in 1980. And I have a particular view on that, that I feel that if the Beatles would have gotten back together for Live Aid and it was a one-off show, it would have been the greatest show that has ever happened. But if it would have been the start of a tour that they planned on doing together, it would have ended up being a disaster. I think they still had it
Exactly.
in them to get together one more time and
Yeah.
really show everybody that they were still the biggest band in the world and they were still, no matter how many other bands got together for Live Aid,
Yeah.
that they would have had that competitive energy to want to have one really great show. But those
Yeah.
personalities could not continue to work together for a long-term basis.
Now that I completely agree with you. I think if John was alive, I think they would have done that. I could easily see that happening because it wasn't for them and it wasn't for the organisers of a show, but it was for what the whole cause was about. That would have brought them together. But yeah, I was thinking the greatest thing the Beatles ever did was never get back together because when you get to the top of the mountain, where'd you go? It's only one
Right.
way and it's down. And it's like with any good film which doesn't have a sequel or any great short run TV series. One we always quote over here is Faulty Towers. You know, Faulty Towers is a great comedy series, 12 episodes, that's all there ever was. People say, why didn't we do more? Always leave them wanting more. And I think leave the Beatles at their peak where they were, because almost like where we started off, and we were talking about with John, you know, they would have loved to knock him off the pedestal. And no, I think it's the best thing they did was not get back together. Because, like you say, they'd all gone off with their separate careers by then, which is why they needed to split in 70, because they were all producing so much music.
Right.
You couldn't contain it all.
George was only getting one or two songs per album, and he immediately comes out and produces this double album that's one of the greatest albums of all time. And you're just thinking this was the third songwriter in this group, and he has all of this material.
Yeah,
And, John was putting out these albums that are, some of them were weird and experimental, but some of them are some of the best albums
yeah,
that were produced in the decade. And Paul went on to have this incredibly long career that still goes on to this
yeah,
day. So I do think that when you look at how much they were producing, it
yeah,
was impossible to keep those four personalities together
yeah,
any
yeah.
longer. And it
I
was
agree. They couldn't have
probably
done it
that
like that.
tension that made them so good in the first place.
Yeah, competitive nature. That's what you needed. And they was, as you say, producing so many songs. You know, All Things Must Pass, which George wrote, a triple album. And he didn't write his first song until 1963. Don't Bother Me. So he
Right.
was only just starting to pick up. And suddenly then, by the time you get to Abbey Road, their last um, recorded album, the last album they did together, George's songwriting is as good, if not better, than anything John and Paul are producing. And suddenly George Martin is
Absolutely.
thinking, I should have listened to him a bit more. Yeah, you
No,
should.
you are absolutely correct. And, if you think of just even a song like Here Comes the Sun, which, if you were to ask the majority of people to rank their favorite Beatles songs, that would probably come in number one for a lot of people, a really high percentage of them. And like I said, like he was being pushed to be the third songwriter in that
Yeah.
group, and you just can't keep down a talent like that.
No.
David Bedford, we have only scratched the surface of your knowledge of the Beatles. I want everybody to go to davidbedford.com and see everything that you have going on. And I want to thank you for preserving the legacy of this band, because we often hear, whether it's Taylor Swift now, if it was Nirvana when I was a teenager, we hear as big as the Beatles, right?
Yeah.
But there was only one Beatles. And I really appreciate all the work that you have done to preserve that legacy.
Thank you so much, Rick. It's an absolute pleasure. Yeah, you can check anything of mine, davidabedford.com, and it gives links to all my books, blogs, podcasts of my own, anything. I get up to so much stuff. It's good fun, and as you can tell, I enjoy it. I still enjoy it, and I love just sharing that as well. So, great questions as well. I really enjoyed those questions. Brilliant, Rick. Thank you.
David A. Bedford, thank you so much for being on the Irish Baseball Podcast.
Thank you.